You've probably heard of thin kerf blades. You might not know when to use them or why to use them, and I'm just going to run through a thin kerf ripping blade, comparing it to a standard ripping blade, and by the end of this hopefully you'll have a clearer picture of why and when and how they work. I have the pleasure of messing around with these Freud blades. Freud is an Italian company. Their blades are made in Italy and they're stunning cutting tools. These two in particular are from their industrial range, which are, you know, their professional range of blades. But what I'm talking about is general in nature and will absolutely apply to other thin kerf blades compared to, you know, standard full kerf ripping blades as well. Now, these blades are both designed for ripping timber along the grain. Well, that's what ripping means, and that's the job that they will do most effectively. They will cross-cut, but it'll be a somewhat messy cut. It might be a serviceable cut for some applications, and others it might be just too rough. But we're going to kind of restrain ourselves to talking about ripping, which is what they're designed for. I'd say the most common reason that people go into using a thin kerf blade is very often they're trying to get more out of a potentially underpowered saw. So by pushing a thinner blade and thinner teeth through the timber, you're removing less timber, and theoretically the saw is doing slightly less work, which means you can push slightly bigger pieces through or potentially go slightly faster. Now, that is worth considering, and there are a lot of people who are using contractor saws, which are smaller motor, or those little tabletop table saws, which are also a smaller motor, and a thin kerf blade might allow you to rip timber more effectively without jamming up the blade or really slowing down the motor. Now, obviously, I'm in a position in my workshop where I'm using this giant Altendorf, so motor size isn't something that I'm really concerned about. But before I had this saw, when I was using my standard table saw, I would routinely be pushing chunks of hardwood through that would actually slow the motor to the point where it essentially stalled, and it would cut out and I'd have to remove the timber and start it up again. It was very unideal. But a thin kerf blade in that situation would have potentially allowed me to make some of those cuts potentially without stalling the motor. Now, that all sounds well and good, but there are some potential downsides to that. Obviously, with a thinner blade, you have more potential for the blade to slightly bend or warp. Now, that could manifest itself in a couple of ways. One way is if you get a ton of vibration, your cut is actually going to be not very true or potentially wider or rougher than it should be if you have a really nice, thick, stable blade. So in that situation, if your saw is powerful enough, you really should be using the thickest blade that you can to get a really nice, stable cut. So, thin blade means more vibration. The other thing that can happen is, as you're pushing this through the timber, you've got a lot of friction on the blade, regardless of which blade you're using, and a thin blade can be affected by heat more quickly than a thicker blade will. So the thinner metal has a slightly higher tendency to warp. Conversely, it also cools quicker. It heats quicker and cools quicker, but both of those things mean warping is a consideration. Again, that leads to blade wobble, a rougher cut, noisier cut, and just poorer performance in the wood. So again, use a full kerf blade if you are able to. The third time when a thin kerf blade potentially might not perform to its highest level is if you're trying to take a really thin shaving off the side of a piece of hardwood, the blade may actually just deflect away from that wood rather than staying true. And in that situation, a thick full kerf blade should be able to hold that line more easily rather than just bending off the side of that rip that you're trying to create. Now, all of those things sound like downsides, and they are, but it's still worth knowing when a thin kerf blade will be really effective. And the one reason why I often reach for the thin kerf blade is if I'm trying to cut really thin pieces off some hardwood to actually create bended forms, or not quite veneers, but edges to place onto ply or some other sort of substrate. So when I'm trying to purposefully create thin strips and I want to get as many strips out of a piece of timber as possible, then that extra mil that I gain from each cut over 10 cuts is one extra strip. And if I'm doing a whole number of chunks of hardwood, then that means a number of extra strips and less sawdust and less work on the saw to get more material. So that is an advantage as long as you're working with those other considerations in mind. So looking at the results of these cuts, I mean, there's an obvious difference in width of the kerf, as you'd expect. It's about 1 millimeter. And like I said, that does add up over a, whole number of cuts in terms of the amount of pieces you might be able to get out of your stick of timber. I find often I will use a thin kerf blade in a place where others might use a bandsaw, because I have less cleanup to do off a thin kerf than I would from a bandsaw, and I end up losing an equivalent amount of kerf with either application. I did not get any measurable deflection when I was running a piece of hardwood just past the edge of the thin kerf blade, but potentially with a thicker piece of wood, maybe in a few weeks when the blade isn't so razor sharp, I might. I mean, these are really high quality blades, so I'm not expecting a lot, but it is something that you would need to watch out for if you were trying to use a thin kerf blade just as your regular blade all the time. I mean, these Freud blades have given me a fantastic finish. It's ready to glue. It's almost ready to be a finished face. Again, they are brand new, so I expect a really nice clean face, and they're just, high quality professional grade blades. The full kerf blade went through this recycled black butt like no other blade that I've ever experienced. Again, it's brand new, so I have high expectations for it, but it just went through like nothing. I mean, this is a big saw, that's a big blade, but it was a really lovely ripping experience. So that speaks to the quality of these Italian blades. With these blades, you're expected to get, I think, 25 full sharpens out of the carbide tips, so there's a lot of life in there. For a lot of really nice smooth cuts. I hope you've liked the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.